It goes without saying that I am a massive fan of the horror genre, particularly folklore, supernatural, ghost and the occult orientated films, but I do like to dip my toes into what the genre also has to offer. If you're at all a fan of these types of films and horror movies in general, then I would have said it's an absolute necessity to watch some of Hammer Studios' old films from the 50s, 60s and 70s, as they are a goldmine of horror movies in general. I have seen over 25 of their productions and most of them are great. Not to mention that their catalogue has been extremely consistent for me. Nearly anything can be found with Hammer's films in terms of what one may look for in a horror movie. Fancy a zombie movie involving curses? Look no further than The Plague of Zombies. Satanic rituals and devil worshipping? The Devil Rides Out. A 9-film series about Bram Stoker's Dracula? Yep, they have that as well. Rarely did they dabble in the beloved genre blend of science fiction and horror, but what they did was fantastic. Whether it be some great films in their 7-installment Frankenstein series, to one of my personal favourites, the Quatermass series of films. Whereas a lot of the films by this company were originals or based on pre-existing monsters and mythology, like the other two mentioned series, this one was unique in that it was based on a trilogy of television serials. The first of these broadcasts was in 1953 with the now iconic and groundbreaking The Quatermass Experiment, which was followed 2 years later with Quatermass 2, and finally Quatermass in the Pit from 1958 and 1959. Both these television versions and film adaptations were extremely popular at the time of their releases, and even led to a movie called X the Unknown, which was intended to be an original sequel to the first flick featuring the main character Professor Bernard Quatermass, but was interfered with and prevented by the original creator, Nigel Kneale. This Isle of Man born screenwriter would end up working on several pieces of television and film related productions that are extremely iconic for the genres of sci-fi and horror. In fact, if it wasn't for the 1950s serials of Quatermass, we may not have the cultural phenomenon that is Doctor Who. I have reviewed the Hammer film, The Quatermass Experiment, on the channel, and in it I brought up how I felt that the 7th season of Doctor Who is very much in line with the previous 6 seasons of the 1960s, in that it is very much a look back at its roots and a celebration of the origins of the show, as it very much extrapolates elements of the Quatermass trilogy and uses them to great effect. Point being, Doctor Who owes a lot to Kneale's creation and is not afraid to show it in areas. Nigel is ultimately my favourite screenwriter of all time and has constructed many of what I would consider to be some of my most cherished pieces of television. Very much his magnum opus, in my opinion, would be the television version of The Pit. By the point that this was in production and ready to roll out, the franchise was already an incredible success for the BBC. I've even heard of stories of that pubs and the likes would empty for people rushing home to see the Quatermass Experiment in 1953, which set an all-time high at the time for 5 million viewers for the 6th and final episode, State of Emergency. Whereas the previous 2 entries definitely do deserve mention amongst the catalogue of Nigel Kneale, I think it's undoubtedly the 3rd one that is what not only catapulted the creator into the status of being a legend with regards to the horror genre, but also displayed how creative and genius he really was. It may be weird to some modern day audiences that I and many others speak so highly of this now over 60-year-old television serial, but it is really more than worthy of that. It's pretty much 3.5 hours long, with the 6 episodes varying from 31 to 36 minutes. It makes use of all of that runtime remarkably well. The incorporation of folklore, science fiction, the paranormal, poltergeists and even politics and war in some parts, all within its expansive plot, iced with some incredible and deep characters, is just scratching the surface of what a masterpiece this serial truly is. Now, to fully talk about and to describe the impact that I feel that this television event has had for the world of paranormal television and horror, I do need to talk spoilers for a bit. So, if you are at all wary of them, there is a time skip on screen right now. The Half Men is the opening 35 minutes of the story and lays down the foundation and groundwork for the rest of the story extremely well. During an excavation project at Hobbs Lane, Knightsbridge, London, a skull is found. This soon falls into the hands of Dr. Matthew Roney, who thinks that this discovery is of unparalleled importance, and after examinations, he estimates it to have been buried for 5 million years. However, events only get stranger in this episode, as below where the skull was found, the discovery of what is thought to be an unexploded bomb is made. The second episode, aptly titled The Ghosts, continues from the first episode and establishes the stories of the paranormal around Knightsbridge and Hobbs Lane for this adventure. This aspect of the story is expanded upon a lot throughout the rest of the runtime, but perhaps most importantly in the third episode, where research is done and these types of stories have been documented for centuries in the area. In The Ghosts, Quatermass investigates a mysterious house next to the excavation site after hearing from an elderly couple residing in Hobbs Lane that nobody would live in it because it is supposedly haunted. Venturing into said house, Bernard finds massive scratches on one of the walls and gets chatting to a police officer on how they remember how much commotion and drama that the building caused back in the late 1920s. The addition of this conversation adds a lot to this plot point, I would have said, as the officer shows how much of a menace, so to speak, that this house was, as they recall that when he was a child, him and his mates would play a dare game of running up to the building and touching the front door. Really goes to show what kind of a reputation that the building had, in my opinion. The professor ends up finding the pensioner residents again and begins talking to them about the supposedly haunted house, as they had been at their Hobbs Lane house for both of the wars and were long-time witnesses to the apparent paranormal events. The woman of the two talks about how they heard tapping and knocking noises, as well as how things would move about on their own. Closing up this instalment, the longest episode of the serial at almost 37 minutes, is the strange cliffhanger that happens. The now dig of what is thought to be an unexploded bomb has progressed significantly enough to the point where it is revealed that the discovered object is actually a capsule. Inside, a soldier gets the fright of his life whenever he sees a figure in the capsule that passes through its walls, which in turn matches as to how an apparitional sighting apparently happened, as seen and detailed by the elderly woman earlier on in the episode. In the third part, dirt from the interior of the capsule is washed away, revealing what appears to be some type of bulkhead with a pentacle etched into it, this being a symbol that was used in ancient black magic. At the end of this instalment, a compartment behind the symbol is revealed, presenting a chamber with strange membrane fronds of organic matter, but most importantly, 3 dead insects-like tripod creatures. As the overall story progresses from this point onwards, it is realised that these potential Martians intervened in the overall evolution of the human race, having captured specimens of the primitive forms of man and genetically altering them and reintroducing them to the planet approximately 5 million years to this discovery. These specimens fell into place on the evolutionary timeline, and as such the human race are descendants of these experimental figures. The skull found in the Half-Men and others in and around the capsule with other events are the fossilised remains of some of these altered examples of primitive man. This in turn explains that we effectively got the abilities of telepathy, telekinesis and other psychic powers thanks to this alien intervention, which then goes on to explain and gives the reason as to how and why the paranormal exists, as we were unknowingly using the psychic inheritance given to us by the aliens to trigger things like poltergeist activity, and also how some are clairvoyant and why some see apparitions. What I detailed in the previous paragraph very much comes to a head in episode 4, The Enchanted, with what I will say is the finest cliffhanger in television history from what I have seen. Not to mention that this episode's title basically mirrors the plot in regards to what humanity is thanks to the aliens. This basically explains that anything and everything to do with the supernatural is in thanks to the evolutionary intervention of these extraterrestrials. Accompanying this, there are hints throughout at other aspects of the supernatural, like with the pentacle as seen inside the capsule store, which was a symbol that was used in ancient black magic, as I mentioned earlier. At the beginning of episode 5, a character remarks that they knew something was going to happen and felt cold. This could be a nod towards the reported phenomena of how people can either feel or detect, using equipment, drops or sudden fluctuations of temperature whenever an entity is in the process of manifesting itself, which are commonly referred to as cold spots. There's also the point of how it is made apparent that the image of the devil himself was based off of the appearance of these aliens, one that plays a significant part in the overall narrative, as it uses this to incorporate the folktale of the Wild Hunt, which also explains things like why war is happening in the world, another subconscious faculty within us. This point is also hammered home during the grand finale, where the image of one of the aliens manifests itself above the excavation site in Hobbs Lane in true devil style. Overall, it is simply astounding the amount of depth and thought that Nigel Kneale put into the creation of this piece. Whereas the plot itself is very much what is driving this to be an entry within this documentary series, this isn't to say that there aren't other pieces of merit to give this serial, as everything else is perfect, I would have said. Mutations, as created by Trevor Duncan, is simply one of the best pieces of title music that I have ever heard, and is a perfect thing to use with regards to either opening the whole serial or an episode from it. Not to mention that the music throughout is just superb and so atmospheric and wonderful. The production values throughout are also astonishing, with what I think are referred to as the locusts in the movie adaptation being extremely memorable alien creatures, and thankfully weren't changed a terrible lot in the just mentioned flick version. The overall sets and props are also extremely well created, like the ever deepening title area or the wrecked haunted house that sits close by. The characters are also great, with Andre Morel giving an incredible performance as the titular Quatermass for this serial. Watching this, it is extremely easy to see where the idea of the Doctor came from. At the point of this serial, when it was all said and done, Nigel Kneale was just simply done with the Quatermass franchise on the whole, having felt that he had taken the character as far as he could, but it wasn't quite the end here. As I mentioned, the series was popular enough to have attracted the attention of Hammer Films Productions. In 1955, their adaptation of the Quatermass experiment, with the E removed to emphasise the rating of the film, was released. This was done behind Kneale's back, and he wasn't happy with it much at all. And I've also heard that he mainly did what he did in terms of contributions to Hammer Films for the money, although I'm not sure how this fits in completely. One of his main dislikes of this Val Guest directed 1955 film was the Americanization of the title character. Whenever this film was released, it was a massive success, and this in turn led to the company wanting to capitalize on that, and led to a similarly plotted and themed film titled X the Unknown being released the following year. This was intended to be an original sequel to the Quatermass experiment from the previous year, but this was snuffed out whenever Nigel Kneale refused to allow them to use the Professor Quatermass character whenever a request was made to do so. In 1957, Val Guest, the director of the first movie, would appear in conjunction twice with both Kneale and Hammer Films. These were two further movie adaptations of television work by the writer, Quatermass 2 and The Abominable Snowman, the last of which was based on a 1955 90-minute television production he did called The Creature, which is believed to have been lost. However, I have heard that both versions of the story were next to identical and also had horror icon Peter Cushing in each iteration. 1 decade later, the movie adaptation of Quatermass and the Pit finally surfaced, which was the sixth and last film Neil was either involved in or indirectly involved in with Hammer. The previous year saw the release of The Witches, an adaptation of The Devil's Own by Nora Lofts, which Nigel wrote. This all leads to a bit of an oddity with the guy's works, I would have said, something titled The Road, which has or had 3 different versions. It started as a 55-minute episode of a drama series entitled First Night in 1963. Then only a few months later, a 75-minute Australian version was screened, with a Radio 4 adaptation aired more recently in 2018. To give a brief plot summary of this production, set in 1775, an investigation using primitive scientific technology is carried out in some woods that are reported to be haunted. The episode ended with the characters being witness to what they had all heard, which turns out to be an echo from the future of people screaming on a busy motorway in the 1960s. I said I considered this to be a bit of an oddity, as it seemed like, to me anyways, that a lot of Neil's popular television works of the time were adapted by Hammer Films Productions, of which this wasn't. Not to mention that this play was a period piece as well, and I feel that Hammer executes those types of movies in terms of their visual style very well. Maybe it's because of things to do with rights with the creation of the Australian version the following year, but still, I feel that this would have made for a great gothic horror movie. According to Into the Unknown, The Fantastic Life of Nigel Neal by Andy Murray, neither television version of The Road is known to exist. However, there is an interesting part later on about this play in the book at page 293. In 2002, the BBC were reportedly thinking of adapting the Quatermass serials for radio, and it was around this time that Mark Gatiss approached them with interests of making The Road again, which, according to the book, wasn't the first time that a remake of this play had been attempted and or mooted, with some efforts having apparently been made in the 1990s. This is definitely something that I would like to see return to the television archive. I don't have a clue as to which version was meant to be better, but from the plot alone, I would love to see this piece return somehow, and I could very much say the same thing with Out of the Unknown's The Chopper from 1971, another television episode penned by Neil. Whereas I could immediately go into talking about the 4th series of this show and how it's more of a horror and fantasy program in relation to its previous 3 seasons of science fiction, there are some interesting and further ties to both this show and Nigel Neal that I would like to talk about. In 1965, it is known that the creator of Out of the Unknown, Irene Shubik, approached Nigel with the idea of creating a new Quatermass story to open up the show, which ultimately came to nothing. This would be the end of that, here and there, but Into the Unknown theorises that a rumour involving Doctor Who happened because of this. Whenever Patrick Troughton announced that he would be leaving the role, the BBC thought that this would be the moment to end the show, mainly because of low ratings during season 6 from what I can gather. Around this time, myths started to surface that the company was thinking of bringing back Quatermass as some type of replacement for Doctor Who, although Neil himself was certain that no such discussions took place. Amongst those that knew about this rumour were some members of the Doctor Who production team, including Terence Dix, who had watched the serials from the 1950s. To me, this does make sense in consideration of the end of season 6 of Doctor Who with the War Games, as that had no regeneration sequence, with the same being said for the 3rd Doctor's first story with Spearhead from Space, which just opted for a new body of the character to fall out of the TARDIS instead of a moment of the iconic transitionary sequence. This would mean at some point in between the wrap of production of Season 6 and the genesis of the 7th that Doctor Who was cancelled or on the fringes of uncertainty, not to mention that the unclear nature of the bridging between the War Games and Spearhead has led to a theoretical in-between season involving the Doctor's implied regeneration being stopped and him being made by the Time Lords to do tasks for them. An example of stories from what is commonly dubbed Season 6B is the novel World Game and a short story from within the other book called Players, but there are many, many more. I would have said that such a rumour involving and intertwining all three franchises and or shows is very likely, not only because Quatermass was very much a prototype Doctor Who, but also in that with Out of the Unknown, there was a ton, and I mean a ton, of parallelisms to Doctor Who. To highlight two of the most major ones, Series 2's The Prophet had several robot costumes being made for its production, with the Mind Robber reusing a small bunch of these, albeit with modifications. The finale to Series 3, however, was somehow even more interesting, as this episode, Get Off My Cloud, was basically Inception before Inception, with fights within dreams. This in turn utilised the TARDIS prop as well as a Dalek of the original voice artist. As if the vast and almost beyond countable amount of tangling and crossing of threads that all three of these television entities had just couldn't get any more vast and somewhat epic seeming, Series 4 of Out of the Unknown somehow manages not only to add more to this cluster of strings, but also ends up bringing everything together and full circle in perhaps the ultimate crossing. Its 9th episode was not only written by Nigel Neal, but has Patrick Troughton starring as the main role as well. The Chopper's plot, from what little I know about it, involves Jimmy Reed, a person that works at a motorcycle garage whom has a haunted motorbike at the workplace. A very simple but excellent sounding premise. Despite the episode not existing, I can however easily relive the episode, essentially, with Mark Ward's volume on the show, as this book goes over every single episode of the show and has write-outs that last about 4 to 5 pages of all 49 of the instalments. I have not read this part on the Chopper from the book yet, but I would definitely like to. Unfortunately, like with many programs at the time, Out of the Unknown is incomplete in the archives due to practices with videotape at the time. Less than half of what was made of the overall 49 episode run is left for us to view now. Of the 20 existent episodes from the overall run of the program, none of these 3 parallelistic episodes I have mentioned are amongst them. Out of the Unknown's 4th and final series was and is an interesting case of the missing episodes, however, and I could even speculate that by today we may have had all of the components represented in some form. In terms of existing video material, To Lay a Ghost, This Body Is Mine, Death Day, Welcome Home and The Man in My Head episodes survive in their entirety and original forms in the archives. A small 33-second clip from Australian censors of The Last Witness also exists. A complete audio recording of The Uninvited has been uncovered as well. Thanks to the website Zeta Minor that I have used to gather information for this show, this auditory taping was one of an unspecified amount that were made by a fan, which also included the Chopper. Considering that this viewer managed to at one point record the audio of at least 2 episodes confirmed from Series 4, I think it's feasible to speculate that they may have also recorded other missing episodes from this series. I would also like to quickly mention that of the recordings that this fan did, the only one that has survived is The Uninvited, so we can't unfortunately listen to the Chopper, unfortunately, despite it being recorded at one point. In 1984, Hammer Films Productions created the show titled Hammer House of Mystery and Suspense, which was a 1-series anthology show comprising of 13 70-minute episodes. The programme actually remade 2 of the missing episodes from Out of the Unknown Series 4, with A Distant Scream being The Last Witness and In Possession being The Uninvited. Thanks to this particular show existing, we can technically watch 7 of the episodes from Series 4 today, despite mystery and suspense in itself being hard to find. As I pointed out in another video, Zeta Minor also states that there is further uncertainty around the chopper and the shattered eye, as documentation suggests that these were sent to Dubai at one point, but they were not returned, and possibly still are in existence. As you can gather, there's a lot of interesting stuff out there in regards to this series of the show and its missing episodes. But what about what we can watch? With the box set of the show as released by the BFI, the 6th and 7th discs contain remastered versions of the 5 existent episodes of the series, 2 stills galleries, a reconstruction of The Uninvited, which is the audio recording synchronized to the camera script due to a lack of photographic material remaining from the installment, and a 42-minute documentary on the show on the whole. To go through my highlights of these 2 discs, as I have seen all of the main features in this box set, To Lay a Ghost is quite a twisty and adult story involving rape and the paranormal, but despite how disturbing it can be, it is still a good watch. A very creepy and well done existing episode. The block of 20 existent episodes from Out of the Unknown ends on a high with The Man in My Head, which I find to be a fantastic allegorical brainwashing story from memory. The reconstruction of The Uninvited proved to be a creepy watch despite the unorthodox recon. It's a shame that this one no longer exists, as this seems to have been absolutely superb. And finally, Return to the Unknown, the documentary on the 7th disc, is an excellent way to cap off the box set, providing some very interesting insight into the show, not to mention the showcasing of tantalising glimpses that are the clips from otherwise lost episodes, particularly Liar and Random Quest from Series 3. And so, with 1971's The Chopper, it seemed that the sheer Quatermass domination of Nigel's career in the 50s and 60s had come to an end. However, this was only the beginning of his career, as some of his best and most iconic work was to follow in the years to come.